Well, first, I would like to congratulate MUFON for persisting with trying to bring people together to hear, hopefully, information that, unfortunately, we don't get on the 6 o'clock news, and we rarely get on any news programs about phenomena that are occurring around this planet on a regular basis. And it seems that there should be more attention, but what I've learned is that it is not in the interests of the political powers that be to have anybody paying attention to the phenomena for reasons that perhaps by the time that I have finished tonight, that you will share where I have come to feel a certain kind of sadness and compassion for people in the government, in any government, that have been faced with what seems to be emerging as a pattern of an almost underbelly about why the government of the United States, in cooperation probably with the British government and our other allies from World War II, would have come to a decision perhaps as early as the Roosevelt administration, but certainly officially in the Truman administration, that there had to be a policy of denial in the interests of national security for the foreseeable future. And it is now about 60 years later, and it is still in force. And what I'm going to try to do tonight is to lay out a kind of evolution as I have gone through it, from having been introduced by Andrew Kistner to material that he had received from sources while they were actively working in White Sands in the late 80s, in the early 90s, when he was there. And then he became a political representative in Las Cruces and decided that what he was hearing, he needed to formalize and focus into both work as a political leader in the state of New Mexico and in a manuscript that he sent to me that I will be sharing with you, as well as what I think is one of the most important leaks of all time, and that is the Majestic 12 documents that include the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit document and the Psalm 101, which, if Stanton Friedman were here, even Stanton now says that he thinks that the weight of authenticity is on the side of actual fact when it comes to the Psalm 101 document about the crash retrieval and how to handle the bodies and technologies of extraterrestrial biological entities as stated in that document that is dated 1954. As Steve was saying in the introduction, it was in the mid-1990s for the first time when I was approached by former Las Cruces, New Mexico State Representative Andrew Kistner. And he laid out all of this information that he was getting off the record that was coming to him not only from White Sands, but from a longtime school friend who had gone on to have a career in the Naval Research Lab and was also leaking to him information that was complementing what he was learning from the White Sand colleagues. And Representative Kistner, in that position, officially asserted to me that what he had learned is in the late 1940s to early 1950s, there was an American government policy to shoot down unidentified aerial discs, but the discs retaliated. Many of our pilots died, which forced an end to our shoot-down policy, and the year that I understand that our policy was rescinded was 1954. I will present information about the possible nature of the disc retaliation and other phenomena linked to an apparent non-human intelligence in those discs. Representative Kistner said that he learned President Harry S. Truman ordered a policy of denial in the interests of national security about all UFO crash retrievals and all related matters, a classified executive order in force to this day, according to Representative Kistner. In 1993, Andy Kistner also shared information with New Mexico Congressman Steve Schiff, who had asked the Government Accounting Office to investigate the controversial July 1947 Roswell UFO crash for maybe the 6th or 7th time that people had asked for investigations and were always told nothing happened. It was only a weather balloon. The GAO investigation was reported July 28, 1995, in a document entitled Results of a Search for Records Concerning the 1947 Crash near Roswell, New Mexico. 8 months later, Congressman Schiff died after a long battle with skin cancer, and he was 51 years old. After his death, the Washington Post and Associated Press wrote, and this is a quote, "Congressman Schiff gained headlines in 1993 when he reopened a federal investigation into the so-called Roswell incident, in which extraterrestrial beings were purported to have crashed northwest of Roswell, New Mexico in 1947, unquote. And I bet that is the first and only time that the Washington Post has ever put the word extraterrestrial in the same paragraph with a story about a congressman. The U.S. Air Force would not concede that it has long been hiding extraterrestrial evidence. Instead, the Air Force argued in its June 1997 report, Roswell Case Closed, that a secret high-tech spy balloon called Project Mogul had crashed, not an alien spacecraft. This was about the third time that the Air Force had come forward saying they were going to close the record on Roswell, and this time the only thing they did was change weather balloon to a spy balloon called Project Mogul. Further, the Air Force said that any reported bodies could be explained as wooden dummies or wounded or dead pilots in government research. Now, wooden dummies and dead pilots were a brand new twist on the U.S. government's previous insistence for half a century that the only thing that had come down between Roswell and Corona in July of 1947 was a weather balloon. And even the mainstream media, led by CBS, did some research and reported that wooden dummies were not dropped out of any balloons anywhere in the United States until the mid-1950s, not 1947. And this was one of those moments where the Air Force's changing explanations implied knowledge of another truth and deliberate cover-up. Congressman Schiff's GAO investigation did turn up this July 8, 1947 teletype message from the FBI in Dallas to FBI headquarters in Cincinnati, Ohio. And the FBI memo read to, quote, "Director and Strategic Air Command, Cincinnati, urgent. Flying disc information concerning name blacked out, headquarters, 8th Air Force. Telephonically advised this office that an object purporting to be a flying disc was recovered near Roswell, New Mexico, this date. The disc is hexagonal in shape, which is six-sided, and was suspended from a balloon by cable, which balloon was approximately 20 feet in diameter. Another blacked out name. Further advised that the object found resembles a high-altitude weather balloon with a radar reflector, but that telephonic conversation between their office and Wright Field had not borne out this belief. So in the same telegram, they are contradicting the balloon and reflector hypothesis. Disc and balloon being transported to Wright Field by special plane for examination. Information provided this office because of national interest in case. Blacked out, in fact, National Broadcasting Company, Associated Press, and others attempting to break story of location of disc today. Blacked out, advised would request Wright Field to advise Cincinnati office results of examination. No further investigation being conducted. An FBI spokesman confirmed the authenticity of this teletype message to Congressman Schiff. And since the teletype message says investigators decided that the hexagonal-shaped object was not a weather balloon, does that mean that the unidentified object had collided with a high-altitude balloon and both had come down? Beyond this FBI message, the Defense Department did not or would not provide Congressman Schiff any 1947 documents from the Roswell Army Airfield. The excuse was that messages sent from the Roswell base in 1947 had somehow been destroyed without authorization. That DoD reply so angered Congressman Schiff that he held a news conference in Washington, D.C. to express his terrible frustration. Schiff told reporters, quote, "The GAO report states that the outgoing messages from Roswell Army Airfield for this period of time were destroyed without proper authority," unquote. And those are the messages that would have shown how military officials in Roswell were explaining to their superiors exactly what was happening. Congressman Schiff said, quote, "It is my understanding that these outgoing messages were permanent records, which should never have been destroyed. The GAO could not identify who destroyed the messages or why," unquote. Schiff also added, quote, "At least this effort caused the Air Force to acknowledge that the crash vehicle was no weather balloon. That explanation of a weather balloon never fit the fact of high military security used at the time." Tonight, I have information from former New Mexico State Representative Andy Kistner to share about why President Harry Truman allegedly authorized a 1947 classified executive order and extension of the War Powers Act that would enforce a strict cover-up of all matters related to an extraterrestrial presence on this planet. For several years, one of Andy Kistner's most important sources was a high-ranking officer at White Sands Proving Ground who died in 1998. And here is what that officer told Kistner were national security reasons to deny the ET presence. Government insiders saw radar and photographs in 1947 which showed advanced aerial devices which easily paced our rapidly moving V-2 rocket tests. Government insiders were shocked that an advanced beam technology can lift up and lower animals and people. Government insiders concluded at least one non-human agenda is to harvest genetic material from animals and people transported by that beam technology. And government insiders learned that the non-human intelligence has and will retaliate if attacked. In 1994, I received this unpublished book manuscript entitled Peculiar Phenomenon, Early United States Efforts to Collect and Analyze Flying Discs by then New Mexico State Rep. J. Andrew Kistner from Las Cruces in Donna Ana County. He felt that the public should know what he had been hearing from insiders at White Sands and the Naval Research Lab. The facts were, he said, that UFOs had been seen and photographed during V-2 rocket launches and that anti-aircraft artillery was deliberately fired at the discs. Here is an excerpt from Andy Kistner's still unpublished manuscript. Quote, "The most highly classified episode in American military history began with a series of events in May of 1947 that ultimately resulted in the crash and recovery of at least 2, probably 3, and possibly 4 extraterrestrial flying discs. This was accomplished by deliberate anti-aircraft artillery fire and/or use of surface-to-air missiles by units of the United States Army National Anti-Aircraft Artillery School at Fort Bliss, Texas, and the United States Army Air Force fighters based at Alamogordo Army Airfield at Alamogordo, New Mexico. The well-publicized Roswell Corona, New Mexico flying disc was one of these, shot down by us. The U.S. Army's actions either caused or were a response to offensive overt acts initiated by flying discs themselves. Whatever flying discs are, they are not defenseless. Their special weapons were and even now are unconventional. Flying discs were immediately defined by the United States military in 1947 as, quote, an enemy weapons system, unquote, official. To secure flying disc crash sites and to collect debris, a T-force, that's capital T-force, was assigned. And in a 1992 book entitled Science with a Vengeance, T-force was described as, quote, a specialized U.S. military unit assigned a mission to take, hold, and defend a specialized enemy facility or a specific piece of enemy equipment possessing high scientific or technical value as defined by Office of Scientific Research and Development and the Joint Chiefs of Staff during World War II. The T-force was always assigned to that which was defined as enemy. Andrew Kistner said that, quote, once collected, the foreign discs were processed and analyzed for Dr. Vannevar Bush, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's Research and Development Board, shown in this photograph, shaking hands with America's first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, after Dr. Bush was sworn in as chairman of the Research and Development Board on September 30th, 1947. That would have been only 3 months after at least 3 discs came down in the state of New Mexico. Dr. Bush was also director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development that cooperated with the Atomic Energy Commission's Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory and its now famous Z division at Sandia Base that was also linked to research and back engineering of extraterrestrial technology. Representative Kistner also was told that, quote, custody of flying discs was permanently vested in civilian authorities by classified presidential executive order in July 1948, and the reason would be to keep the public from having any official access to what was happening as long as it was put in a civilian category. That civilian authority was the Atomic Energy Commission and its national laboratories. AEC participated with the Department of Defense's Air Force Systems Command, the Naval Research Laboratory, and the Research and Development Board of the Secretary of Defense, also established in late July 1947. The Research and Development Board coordinated all scientific inquiry, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff provided military support, and the National Security Council, newly formed in August of 1947, served as overall program coordinator, and it is my understanding that to this day, that the batons passing through the Majestic 12 group has always been through some kind of very compartmentalized section inside the National Security Council. Quote, it should be noted that within these major institutions, the investigations and retrieval operations of flying discs were and are today classified in compartments that are very small. It is not the entire institution that has knowledge. Rather, it is only specialized components within much larger complexes that have need-to-know access about the non-human presence, unquote. In his manuscript, Andy Kistner picked out the afternoon of May 15, 1947, as the first deliberate American effort to shoot down a flying disc. V-2 rocket tests at White Sands were underway, and that day, one was launched to an altitude of 84 miles. It carried instruments to measure cosmic and solar radiation temperatures, ionospheric measurements, and photo experiments for the Naval Research Lab. The V-2 rocket crashed east of the impact zone on the outskirts of Alamogordo, New Mexico. And about that V-2 crash, here is what the May 16, 1947 Las Cruces Sun News article headlined, quote, Lieutenant Colonel Harold R. Turner, White Sands Proving Ground commanding officer, blamed, quote, peculiar phenomena, unquote, for the erratic test flight of a German V-2 rocket which landed only 6 miles east of Alamogordo, unquote. Well, what actually happened during that May 15, 1947 V-2 rocket launch? State Representative Andrew Kistner learned from his confidential sources that the facts remain classified and off-limits to public and media to this day. But Colonel Turner's reference to peculiar phenomena was his discreet way of not saying unidentified aerial discs. How was the peculiar phenomena described? Andrew Kistner says that it was a radar target that instantaneously appeared next to the rising V-2 missile, and immediately the V-2 rocket changed course. Kistner says his White Sands military sources saw a photograph of a flying disc that had been taken from a camera mounted inside of a V-2 rocket looking out a window, and that the disc is pacing right outside the window, enough so that they got several photographs of this pacing with the rocket. The peculiar phenomena caused the V-2 rocket at White Sands Proving Ground to change course, taking a northeasterly track, one that brought the rocket crashing to Earth 2 minutes later, only 6 miles east and slightly north of the populated community of Alamogordo, New Mexico. And by then, it was 40 degrees off the V-2's projected flight path on May 15, 1947. An Army officer at White Sands Proving Ground told Andy Kistner, quote, "The peculiar phenomenon object was defined as hostile in that it appeared to have affected the V-2 rocket's trajectory. It was by every definition an advanced foreign weapons system. Effort would be expended to guard against further intrusions, and high priority was assigned to collect a specimen of the technology for further analysis, and covertly was stressed, if possible," unquote. That phrase, high priority assigned to collect a specimen of the technology, meant the creation of covert American government units to bring down unidentified flying objects which could pace launch V-2 rockets and cause them to veer off course. Those retrieval units operated under projects Moondust and Pounce, which were responsible for securing airspace over White Sands Proving Ground. One of their classified missions was to aggressively bring down the advanced disks to study and potentially back engineer. The first time that I was ever exposed to this idea that we were trying to take disks out of the sky, make them crash, was back in the early 1980s when I first sat down with Len Stringfield, a pioneer in crash retrieval investigations, the author of UFO Situation Red, who did remarkable work in trying to keep track, both in the United States and around the world, with stories having to do with crash retrievals. He had been working with the Air Force in an official capacity in the early 1950s from his home and office area in the Cincinnati, Ohio region, and he told me he had personal knowledge from the U.S. Air Force that there were orders to shoot down what were called foreign aerial discs at the end of the 1940s. But he said, quote, "Linda, we lost so many of our own airplanes and pilots that the order was rescinded by the mid-1950s," unquote. And again, my understanding is that the order was rescinded in 1954, 2 years after the big intense flap over Washington, D.C., in which there were so many objects seen over the Capitol and tracked on radar at high rates of speed in July 1952. Did the United States deliberately use weapons to bring down one or more foreign discs? Well, Andy Kistner says the answer is definitely yes, and his source was a good friend who had previously worked for the Naval Research Lab. And I'm going to play for you now just a brief excerpt from a conversation with Andy Kistner when he was a representative. And I'm going to play this now through the microphone. We can make it work.
He was a co-worker of mine, and he'd, back in the mid-60s, been taken to a facility somewhere in the state of New Mexico that was underground, and there was a warehouse, and there was a flying disc inside the warehouse, inside this bunker. And he noted visually and was told verbally by the briefing officer that this was one of several flying discs shot down at Roswell in 1947. And what he observed and was told was that it was shot down with 20 millimeter cannon fire. And he observed on the flying disc penetrations of the skin and exit holes through the top of the aircraft, through the top of the flying disc, and was told that it was a product of 20 millimeter cannon fire.
According to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, quoting, in July 1944, 3 years before all of the activity in Roswell and White Sands with the discs, the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance requested Section T, that same Section T, of the Office of Scientific Research and Development to study anti-aircraft missiles to counteract the Japanese OCA, piloted bombs and other suicide weapons sent against the United States in the Pacific. The requirements was for a missile to shoot down a plane at a range of 20,000 yards at an altitude of 30,000 feet. Quote from the Smithsonian. 4 months later, by November of 1944, the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance assigned the Applied Physics Laboratory of the Johns Hopkins University in Silver Spring, Maryland, to undertake the development of radar-guided surface-to-air missiles. This project became known as Bumblebee, which produced several ramjet-powered missiles. So if someone says to you, we did not have surface-to-air missiles to try to take down discs in the late 1940s, you can say, I'm sorry, go to the Smithsonian, and you will find that we did. Spurred on by his off-the-record military and intelligence sources, Representative Andy Kistner studied newspaper archives and came to the startling conclusion that, quote, it does not appear that flying discs were passive actors in 1947. Between May 9th and July 31st, more than 600 military and civilian airplanes crashed worldwide, unquote. That is an average of 7 airplane crashes a day for 84 days. The peak of plane crashes seemed to come after this famous May 29th, 1947 Juarez, Mexico explosion, which was reported as another V-2 rocket, this time veering 180 degrees off course. That means the rocket went like this and then like that. It went 180 degrees off course. And this was only 2 weeks after the Alamogordo V-2 crash, in which Colonel Turner described the peculiar phenomena. The truth was about this V-2 going off course, according to Kistner, that the May 29, 1947 event was an American military test of a surface-to-air missile strike against an unidentified radar object. Again, it was White Sands commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harold R. Turner, who was there trying to do a secret V-2 launch that day on May 29th, but problems kept delaying liftoff. And finally, at about 7:15 in the evening, Mountain Standard Time on May 29th, it is believed, and this is now quoting from Andrew Kistner's manuscript, that at least one Wasserfall surface-to-air missile, complete with a 674-pound high-explosive warhead, was fired at one or more radar targets hovering to the southwest of White Sands Launch Row. 5 minutes later, at an altitude above 60,000 feet, the proximity fuse on the warhead detonated 10 miles north and slightly west of Mount Franklin. The explosion was witnessed by Major General John L. Homer, commander of Fort Bliss, and the El Paso Times reported the next day on May 30th, 1947, that the first explosion occurred more than 10 minutes before a second explosion at least 25 miles further south. General Homer dispatched troops to look for missile wreckage and to investigate the first crash site that was 10 to 15 miles northwest of Fort Bliss going toward White Sands and Mount Franklin. The surface-to-air missile's mysterious target, possibly crippled by the explosion, continued to fly in airspace north of Fort Bliss, eventually impacting within 1 mile of the new and populated Buena Vista Airport, only 6 miles south of downtown Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico. Local residents described a blinding flash of light, followed by a tremendous pressure wave and the appearance of a mushroom cloud. The concussion of the blast was sufficient to crack windows 6 miles north of the crash site, while an electric clock stopped at the El Paso County Sheriff's Office, apparently due to the blast effect. Whatever the mysterious radar object had been was not apparent because it was totally vaporized. Small shreds of burned gray metal fused with molten sand and rock are all that were found near a 50 feet by 24 feet deep crater outside of Juarez. There was no V-2 rocket body at the bottom of the crater hole, and nothing, they found nothing. It was never learned what the security detail dispatched by General Homer found at the site of the first explosion on the east or west side of the Franklin Mountains east of Anthony, New Mexico. And that happened 12 minutes before the explosion in Juarez, where we expected we would find at least our V-2 missile and what the unidentified radar object was. An effective cover story was immediately provided to the press that another V-2 launched from White Sands Proving Ground had gone astray, experienced a total gyroscopic failure, flew 180 degrees off course, and crashed in Mexico. The entire Juarez garrison's rocket recovery efforts resulted in bringing back only a small pile of debris, and there was no explanation why the launched missile, our own V-2 missile, vaporized entirely, unquote. That missile, according to Representative Kistner, was actually a secret surface-to-air rocket attack on one or more of the unidentified radar targets. Another mysterious and important visual detail was provided by the editor of the Las Cruces Sun-News, who watched the May 29, 1947 launch and said that there were 2 first-magnitude stars near the missile before it headed down out of the daylight sky to crash. And it's very clear that in a daylight afternoon situation, you don't see stars in the sky. Andrew Kistner reports that within 72 hours of the Juarez incident, 29 airplanes crashed around the world, killing 198 people. The worst disaster was near LaGuardia Airport in New York, where a United Airlines plane took off, crashed, and burned, killing all 38 people aboard. While government civil aeronautics investigators were returning from the LaGuardia crash, an Eastern Airlines DC-4 went nose down and crashed, killing everyone aboard. According to an eyewitness of the second crash, quote, "I saw the plane in a steep glide and several gleaming things like metal fell away from the plane as it hurtled down," unquote. Were those gleaming things more of the unusual phenomena that appeared on radar alongside V-2 rocket launches and in the photographs taken through the windows? More than one pilot who survived airplane crashes in 1947 said that their airplane was at high takeoff, its speed going down the runway, but there was no lift under the wings at all, and they could not even take off. By June 15, 1947, President Harry S. Truman ordered a special board of inquiry to investigate American air safety. Among his appointees was Dr. Jerome Hunsaker, chairman of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. Dr. Hunsaker was also included on the top secret Majestic 12 list, advising President Truman on the extraterrestrial presence. 2 days later, President Truman's Special Board of Inquiry held a secret session seeking means to prevent air crashes such as have taken, at that time, 146 lives on commercial airlines since May 29, 1947, the date that the V-2 rocket came down in Juarez after doing a 180-degree turn in the sky. 5 years later, on July 29, 1952, newspapers across the United States reported, quote, "Air Force orders jet pilots to shoot down flying saucers if they refuse to land. The Air Force revealed today that jet pilots have been placed on a 24-hour nationwide alert against flying saucers, with orders to shoot them down if they refuse to land, unquote. This is from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer with a Washington, D.C., July 28, 1952 dateline. We have two other newspapers now, Stanton Friedman, Grant Cameron, Bob Wood, and I. We're looking for more of these newspapers. And the significance of this particular date, the fact that publicly it was now asserted in the press that there was a standing order to shoot down flying saucers, came at exactly the same time that there had been the two episodes over the nation's capital in which there had been discs seen in the skies and tracked on radar, and the headlines of that story many of you are, I'm sure, are very familiar with, when Washington, D.C. was up in arms over what was in the sky and flying right over the White House, the Pentagon, and all areas that were supposed to have nothing flying over them. H. Marshall Chadwell, Assistant Director of Scientific Intelligence for the CIA, reported to the Director of Central Intelligence, quote, during July 1952 alone, official reports totaled 250 UFOs. Since 1947, there had been 1,500 official reports. Of the 1,500 reports, quote, Air Force carries 20% as unexplained, and of those received from January through July of 1952, it carries 28% unexplained. Quite a contradiction to the famous, notorious, and totally misleading Project Blue Book public release. Little did I know when I began investigating the worldwide animal mutilations in 1979 for the CBS TV station in Denver that it would lead me through that Alice in Wonderland mirror to that parallel universe where government insiders seem to know a lot about aerial discs and extraterrestrial biological entities while they keep all the rest of us completely in the dark. By 1983, I was working on a home box office TV special called UFOs, the ET Factor. On April 9th, I had a meeting at Kirtland Air Force Base's Office of Special Investigations in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with an AFOSI special agent named Richard C. Doty. Agent Doty showed me an alleged briefing paper for the President of the United States about unidentified aerial vehicles and entities. One of the pages contained a list of locations where American military and intelligence units had retrieved aerial vehicles described in this paper as extraterrestrial. There was no beating around the bush. It was extraterrestrial, along with humanoid bodies, both dead and alive. In addition to the well-known name Roswell, other sites on this crash list included Magdalena near the plains of San Augustine in New Mexico, Kingman, Arizona, northern Mexico south of Laredo, Texas, and Aztec, New Mexico. In 1986, William Steinman and Wendell Stevens wrote a book entitled UFO Crash at Aztec, A Well-Kept Secret. The front cover photograph is familiar to those of you who have made the trek to Hart Canyon, about 12 miles northeast of Aztec, where it seems now it's becoming more and more clear that a 99-foot diameter silver-colored lens-shaped craft was allegedly found on top of the mesa in a spot where even the rocks have been sheared off, apparently by the force of the craft's impact. And you can go there today and you can see these sheared off rocks. Here's a group of us at the alleged landing site in March of 2002 during the Aztec UFO conference, including left to right, Carl Flock, Jim Mars, Stanton Friedman, me, Scott Ramsey, and Stan Gordon. We're standing around a plaque that's dedicated at the location of a silver disc crash, is what it says, according to eyewitnesses in 1948. Some of those eyewitnesses were policemen from Aztec and Cuba, according to their surviving families today, and this is new information as of this past year. The investigator who found those families is businessman Scott Ramsey, Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Express Wire Services in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's standing between Stan Gordon and me on the right in this group photograph. Scott Ramsey's curiosity was provoked by tantalizing details in this book by Frank Scully, Behind the Flying Saucers. And the reason is that Scully talked about the early detection of an aerial disc by top secret radar discs in New Mexico, a disc that allegedly was tracked by radar down through the atmosphere to Aztec. At the same time, Representative Kistner was doing an official New Mexico historical research project trying to find pre-Cold War artifacts, which in his mind might be secret World War II bases. And Kistner wanted to include these bases on the official New Mexico historical landmark list. So Andy Kistner's and Scott Ramsey's research efforts came together to find out whether the top secret radar bases that are mentioned in Scully's book had existed in New Mexico as Scully described. And another question that the two men wanted to answer, did an aerial disc crash near Aztec? And to help get more military facts, Andrew Kistner, in his official state legislator position, arranged an introduction for Scott Ramsey at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, to start looking for anything that had to do with the Cold War in New Mexico and might also relate to the U.S. government's top secret efforts to track discs in the skies. And eventually, Scott and Andy confirmed that 3 powerful radar sites had been built in a triangular configuration to protect the super-secret Los Alamos Laboratory and the Atomic Energy Commission's Sandia Base in Albuquerque. And we're talking now about El Vado to the north of Los Alamos, Moriarty to the south of Los Alamos and directly east of Sandia Base. Los Alamos and Sandia were working tightly together on the development of the atomic bomb under the Manhattan Project. And to the west in Continental Divide, this is the other radar station, creating this triangle. These other positions, it's interesting, this is a map that I have been using since 1979 when I did A Strange Harvest. And this map book is just about falling apart, but it's one of the most valuable things I have because on each page, some states, the overlays of animal mutilations, discs, crashes, crop circles, and other phenomena, they pile up. And one of the states that has some of the most is the state of New Mexico. Now, Los Alamos here, it was a really good place to start out trying to test this new radar, both for protection, because this was the Manhattan Project, the most classified thing that our government had going for it at the time, and they were very concerned about Sandia Base to the south. And what was important is that that whole area in Los Alamos was restricted airspace. Absolutely nothing was supposed to fly over there. Well, this was important because it was clear to the Defense Department that any metallic object that flew through that trio of radar sites, when they were fired up, would not come out of those strong microwaves without damage to whether it was our machines in the sky or something else's. And the 3 classified radar sites, they finally officially became operational in 1948. But no one in the public and the media knew anything about them at all until the February 2000, now we're in the 21st century, February 2000 New Mexico legislature was in session. El Vado is the only secret radar base left in New Mexico with buildings standing, and Andy Kistner, as representative, was able to have that once secret radar, experimental microwave radar station classified in the New Mexico State Historical Register. And the importance of that Elvado radar also is underscored by the fact that it was personally and specifically requested by President Harry Truman himself. Elvado officially functioned in secret from 1948 to 1958 and was also known as Tierra Amarilla Air Force Station P-8. The other two radar sites at Moriarty, east of Albuquerque, and Continental Divide, west of Albuquerque, those three radar sites became part of what was known as the American Aircraft Control and Warning System, or AC&W. That expanded to 411 radar sites from 1948 forward throughout the United States and eventually evolved into NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. AC&W also became known as LASHUP. This is an historic map of the LASHUP program and its aircraft control and warning radar stations provided to Representative Andrew Kistner by the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. And you'll notice the three sites are on there that we just discussed in New Mexico. During Scott Ramsey's research about the three classified radar bases, he looked for evidence that a disk crashed near Aztec, and eventually he was led to families of two Aztec and Cuba, New Mexico police officers who told their families before they died that they had seen a silver disk in Hart Canyon, and the year they gave was 1948. Scott Ramsey told me what the policemen said they saw on that Hart Canyon Mesa during a night in 1948, probably March, and this is the first, just in the last few months, is the first time that Scott Ramsey has talked about this at all, because at first the families did not want him to say anything, and then they now are allowing him, as long as he so far is not identifying the families today. Scott Ramsey.
He finally said to the family, you know, that actually did happen. I'm one of the police officers at the crash site that day. And, you know, going back to the family members, they remember him saying, I was one of the police officers at the scene. Apparently, though, there were three involved. And the one I will mention, and that was Andy Andrews, he was probably in his 50s back at the time of the Aztec incident. We don't really pinpoint him at the crash site, although he may have been with the Cuba police officer going up Highway 44 the night of the alleged crash.
And what exactly did they describe that they saw?
Large saucer-shaped object, no visible markings, no seams, rivets, weld marks, perfectly smooth, more pewter in color. Going back to Ken Farley and Doug Nolan and the two police officers, and going back and retrieving the testimony from the families, they kept using the word, looked like it had been molded. Absolutely perfectly, no seams. Very smooth, pewter in color, sort of a dull gray color. Two lenses put together with a 15 to 18 foot bubble basically in the middle.
Now, what about entities?
Doug Nolan did say he saw at least two. Again, give you a little bit of background on Doug Nolan. He was a 19-year-old employee of the El Paso Oil Company back at this time frame. That's why we are pinpointing it to 1948 based on his 19-year-old age. He was getting ready for work. They start very early out in the oil fields, as you well know. His boss, Bill Ferguson, who's also deceased, when Doug picked him up, said, we've got to get out to Hart Canyon immediately. There's a bad brush fire, and it's near one of the drip tanks that the company owned. And they went out. Bill Ferguson being the lead man at the time, the senior man, and there laid the disc out on the end of the mesa.
And were there entities there?
Doug and Bill Ferguson climbed up on the craft and looked in the window, and Doug said he could see two human-like humanoid beings slumped over.
Such testimonies from policemen and eyewitnesses before their deaths show how well the U.S. government has been able to keep secrets. The Truman administration's strict order of denial and cover-up about UFO crashes and retrievals in the interest of national security has been in effect for nearly 60 years. Did the U.S. military shoot down near Aztec, this silver disk, by cannon fire or by strong microwave radar because it was considered to be a foreign enemy's weapon system? There have been unofficial leaks by military people and others about the discovery of a large disk near Aztec, and this photograph taken by investigator and author Bill Steinman back in the 1980s was what Bill called the, quote, actual Aztec disk crash site, unquote, with charred and sheared off rocks. In addition to the alleged presidential briefing paper that I was shown at Kirtland Air Force Base in 1983 that listed Aztec as a UFO crash site, I have also seen other information about a 99-foot diameter, and that number is given specifically, measured to that strange diameter of 99-foot diameter silver disk with a dome recovered in Farmington and Aztec region. Several years ago, I received a military officer's confidential interview entitled, quote, "The Report on the Crash at Farmington." The officer said that he saw a black and white photograph of a silver disk in a classified file. This image is his computer recreation of that black and white photograph. The geographic location that was given in the file was Farmington, New Mexico, quote, prior to 1950, unquote. The military officer said dead, non-human beings were found inside the craft. The name Farmington in that classified file was thought to have been used because in the 1940s, Farmington was a larger town then than the nearby rural community of Aztec. The military officer said that he had a special security clearance that enabled him to access a restricted military base library prior to 1970, but asked that neither his name, the location, nor the military base, nor the library be given out for his protection. He did say that in addition to this black and white photograph in the file, that there was a book by Major Donald Kehoe. And I think that some of us interested in the history of this phenomena might do well to go back and read Kehoe's work and some of the others around that early 1950s period. The military officer said, quote, "There was a perfectly intact circular-shaped craft, and it was lying somewhat tilted to one side on the ground in the desert. The material of the craft was metallic and resembled brushed aluminum. It was stated that there were portholes on the cabin part of the craft, but they were not made of any type of glass, and the portholes could not be seen from afar. They could only be detected up close. The report said there were two bodies, badly charred. So was the interior of the cockpit of the craft. The bodies were said to be about 4 feet in height. According to the report, we were not responsible for bringing this craft down. The implication was that the United States had shot down other disks. There was mention of a magnetic fault or opening or something like that located in the area where this craft came down. There were 3 of these faults or magnetic openings located in North America. One was in the southwest around the Texas-New Mexico area, one was somewhere in the Carolinas, and one was somewhere in the northeast sector, unquote. The report referred to several crashes, plural, which were compared to the disk found in the Farmington crash file. The officer said, quote, "Officials felt that only people in professional levels were capable of dealing with this information. Based on what occurred with the Orson Welles War of the Worlds radio broadcast in 1938, this information could create panic. Then it would threaten to break down the industrial complex that supports the military, and it would obviously undermine the military. And it could possibly reduce our ability to counter an attack by a hostile alien culture. But it was also clear that the intent of these particular beings was not known." intent. What is the reason that any non-humans would be here? On May 15, 1947, when the unidentified object on radar appeared next to the launch V-2 rocket that immediately went off course, perhaps no one in the United States government knew that around them another peculiar phenomenon was taking place that might be directly linked to the intelligence inside the disks. That phenomenon is the worldwide animal mutilation mystery. For 26 years now, as an investigative TV producer and reporter, I have tried to find facts about this question: what does the United States government actually know about entities and technologies from UFO crash retrievals which have provoked an American policy of misinformation and denial in the interests of national security since at least 1947, if not before? At the same time, the American government and corporations have back-engineered the very same alien technology that they have denied and ridiculed as weather balloons and swamp gas. Back in 1983, while I was working on that documentary project for HBO entitled UFOs, the ET Factor, I was in New Mexico, in Corona, and I met an elderly rancher who had lived there back in 1947. He said that he had known Mac Brazel, the rancher who found the strange debris on the land, and went to the Roswell sheriff to report his discovery on July 4th, 1947. And that man, standing with me at one of those lodgepole pine fences, put his foot up in there and he said, "Linda, I heard that there was a horrible secret about that crash." Perhaps the answer to the horrible secret is why there has been an official American policy ever since to deny ET existence at all costs. That policy could have begun with the fear and shock that President Truman and his close associates felt when they allegedly learned that dissected humanoids and animal parts were found inside and near at least 2 of the UFOs that crashed in New Mexico in 1947. That startling revelation is stated in documents collected by Bob and Ryan Wood in their research of the top-secret Majestic 12 Special Studies Group that was appointed by President Truman in 1947 to study and try to understand the extraterrestrial presence. And I'm going to focus on those documents in just a minute, but the animal parts take me back to when I began my step through the Alice in Wonderland mirror, simply trying to understand what was happening to all the animals, not just around me in Colorado, but all over the United States, Canada, and the world. I've been a TV producer, reporter, and writer covering a lot of science, like this film I did on astronaut training in Colorado, since I graduated from Stanford University with a master's degree in communication. I produced documentaries at the Stanford Medical Center and the Stanford Linear Accelerator, and then I was hired by the NBC television affiliate in Los Angeles, KNBC, to do news reporting and documentaries. I worked later for Boston's ABC affiliate to produce medical and science programs, and then I was hired to be director of special projects at the CBS television station in Denver, Colorado. There I received a National Emmy nomination, several Regional Emmys, and many other journalism awards for my documentary films and live television programs and news that were always focused on science, medicine, and the environment. And I say this only to stress that I was then and I am now a credible mainstream TV producer and journalist when I took on the animal mutilations investigation, and that if the work that I have been trying to do just on animal mutilations would fall into the category of being a mainstream journalist, when I see what ABC Network did in the name of so-called formal network journalism, and I'm talking about the Peter Jennings special about 6 weeks ago, it was atrocious. It was not journalism. It was build a straw horse and knock it down on national television for 2 hours. And it is absolutely enraging that the network can dress itself up as doing investigative journalism and turn in a biased manipulation piece like that. I would like to see, if the networks would just simply take the facts If we were doing something that was showing what was going on in the Roosevelt and the Truman administrations as part of what I'm trying to share tonight, how refreshing that would be. During that year of 1979, hundreds of cattle, horses, and other animals were reported dead with bloodless excisions of the same body parts all over the world. And it was exactly the same type of unusual animal deaths that law enforcement had been reporting since at least the early 1960s. I've seen the same animal mutilation report in a Huntsville, Alabama newspaper with a date line of 1961, and I now know that the reports go back much earlier. I wanted to get to the bottom of this mystery, and I produced the documentary A Strange Harvest. And what I'm going to do now is just quickly go through, for those who may not understand why this is not satanic cult, this is not predator, and the forensic evidence that's been collected over at least the last 2.5 decades that I know about personally takes it outside of the realm of people being able to do this. And we're going to start with the classic. An ear, an eye, a circle of flesh, around the eye, half the jaw flesh, the tongue removed and a vertical deep cut within the throat, as in the Sterling, Colorado case back in the summer of 1976. I talked with the sheriff. This animal was warm to touch when they took this photograph. And this steer in Caldwell, Kansas, discovered on January 31st, 1992. A veterinarian pathologist examined the tissue from the mutilated excisions and confirmed that the cuts had been made with high heat. Also, the yellow arrow points at 2 missing teeth. This is a common characteristic of many mutilated animals, but not widely reported. Back in 1980, after my documentary A Strange Harvest was first broadcast, which linked through law enforcement telling me that they were dealing with creatures not from this planet. This is what law enforcement was telling me, and it's reported through their statements in the film. I received a call from a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer in Calgary. And there were unusual animal mutilations just rampant everywhere in British Columbia and around Calgary. And the stories were that the RCMP was on the track of a satanic cult that was responsible. And yet, on the other end of that phone call was the director of the RCMP Animal Mutilation Investigation. His name was Lynn Lauber. And what is he asking me? He said, "I've heard about your film. I would like you to send me a copy. I think that the direction you're going is the direction that we think this story goes," which was the ET link. And I said, "Sir, I understand, though, from the newspaper articles that I'm getting that you are on the track of satanic cults in Calgary." And there was this long pause, and he said, "It's not true. We don't have any evidence, but it's the way we are keeping the media and the public off our back." And he told me that. And he said, "Another thing I'd like to do is exchange photographs. We keep having a lot of missing teeth, and we've kept it as one of the pieces of the MO of what's happening in these mutilations, and we're not telling anybody. Have you found missing teeth?" And I said, "Yes, and sheriffs here in Colorado have asked me not to report it. I didn't report it in A Strange Harvest because they wanted to keep it as a piece of what the MO was in case there were copycats." So I'm showing you one of the many animals that were found with teeth removed, but it has never been very publicly reported. Other animal mutilation examples are this horse found dead and mutilated in Raymer, Colorado on June 22nd, 1993. The sexual organs are usually excised, as in this completely bloodless removal of half the udder from this cow's white belly near Elizabeth, Colorado in September of 1982. This animal was alive and well at noon. The husband and wife ranchers checked a pasture 1/4 of a mile from the front of their house, where they were on the outside all day painting the house. This was a pasture and where they had 33 pregnant cows. This was one of them. At 5 o'clock, Mr. DeZuris got in his truck to go get hay and found this animal like this. between noon and 5. They never heard anything. They never saw anything till they found this animal in this condition. All 4 teats were bloodlessly cored out of the udder of this Idaho cow in 1989. The penis and testicles were bloodlessly removed in this cookie cutter oval from this bull in Manila, Utah in 1982. Rectal and/or vaginal tissue is removed in nearly 100% of the animal mutilation cases, and sometimes tails are also cut off at the tail bone at the base of the spine, as in this 1976 Sterling, Colorado calf. Animals have been found dead and mutilated on face powder, dry ground, or wet sand without a single track around them, not even their own. And dozens of times, the excisions have had a serrated edge, which veterinarian pathologists have confirmed were made with high heat. Lasers are an obvious first thought, but the problem is animal excisions upon examination under a microscope by qualified hematologists and pathologists do not have carbon residue, which is commonly found after veterinarian and human laser surgeries. We're a carbon-based life form. There should be carbon under a microscope where heat has been attached or applied by a laser. But when we have looked at animal mutilation excisions, we have never found any carbon residue. Now, perhaps the most startling discovery in animal mutilation research ever has been particles of pure bovine hemoglobin on animal bodies, such as this 2,000-pound Black Angus bull discovered in Red Bluff, California on January 17, 1997. There is no known medical way to produce pure hemoglobin except in a laboratory centrifuge. These particles were found around the bull's large circular chest excision by investigator Jean Bilodeau and on the bull's testicle. She sent them to biophysicist W.C. Levengood for analysis. Levengood looked at the particles under a microscope, which showed what is called a common mud cracking appearance that you see in dehydrated organic material. Infrared spectroscopic examination of particles found on the bull's chest excision and his testicles proved that the material was pure bovine hemoglobin. Here is the spectra from the testicles. Here is the spectra from the chest. Here is what's called a baseline comparison. This was purchased, bovine hemoglobin purchased from a lab for the baseline comparison to what was found on the animal. Pure bovine hemoglobin. Pure hemoglobin particles were also discovered on another 2,200-pound mutilated bull found in Alberta, Canada in October of 2000. The next year, pure hemoglobin particles were also found on an Alabama cow shown here in February of 2001. Biophysicist Levengood was very puzzled about how pure bovine hemoglobin would end up on 3 dead cattle ranging from California to Alberta, Canada to Alabama. He wrote in one of his reports, quote, "The bovine hemoglobin's presence suggests a processing of the whole blood has occurred at the excision site, meaning out in the pasture, but that's not possible. The usual procedure for isolating hemoglobin from whole blood is rather complex. It involves separating red blood corpuscles from the lighter plasma components by centrifuge. The plasma is siphoned off and ether is added to the corpuscle paste, causing the cells to burst. Another centrifuge process removes the ruptured cell envelopes and leaves a clear red solution of hemoglobin. So it is unlikely that a procedure such as this would be done on site in the pasture. Thus, it is unknown how or why hemoglobin particles would be a residue on mutilated cows," unquote. Mysterious aerial lights have long been seen and photographed over pastures where animal mutilations have occurred. On the left, in black and white, are time exposure photos taken by reporter Bill Jackson in Sterling, Colorado in 1976. And on the right, in color, are more light photographs in time exposure by Jim Williamson, then editor of the Little River News in Ashdown, Arkansas. The many reports of unidentified silent lights over pastures is why law enforcement looked to the sky for answers right from the beginning. Newspapers started illustrating what ranchers said that they had seen, like this drawing in the November 2nd, 1980 Greeley Tribune in Greeley, Colorado. Many people have seen beams. I have 12 cases in which people say that they have seen a beam come down into a pasture, and they've either seen animals rise in the beam, they've seen animals come down in the beam, or they have seen animals brought up in a beam and then dropped from the sky to the ground, making craters and often breaking the bones in the bodies. And the United States military had knowledge of something coming from the skies and killing and mutilating animals around the world since at least the early 1950s, according to Lieutenant Colonel Philip J. Corso, now deceased, who wrote the important 1997 book, The Day After Roswell. In his book, Colonel Corso described many advanced technologies that the United States government retrieved from crashed non-human aircraft and back-engineered. One of those technologies, according to Colonel Corso, was what he came to be known as a laser scalpel in modern earth medicine. On page 47 of his book, Colonel Corso wrote, quote, "Why did the extraterrestrial inhabitants of the craft have a cutting device like this aboard their ship? It was not until later, when I read highly classified military reports about cattle mutilations in which entire organs were removed without any visible trauma to the surrounding cell tissue, that I realized that the light beam cutting torch was being used by the aliens in medical experiments on our livestock," unquote. But what exactly is the nature of the extraterrestrial cutting device is still puzzling, because we have not been able to find any carbon residue. So we still don't know what precisely the cutting instrument is in the mutilations. Before he died, Colonel Corso talked to me in private about the many classified documents that he had seen in Washington, D.C. in the 1950s to the 1960s after he returned from his World War II assignment in Italy. He told me that he had read with his own eyes highly classified reports dated as early as 1951. 1951 would be only 4 years after all of the action between Corona, Roswell, and White Sands. And that the 1951 and other reports that he saw were about animals found in several parts of the world with bloodless excisions of the same tissues, the same patterns, and no tracks around the bodies. Colonel Corso said that those classified reports specified that the animal mutilators were, quote, extraterrestrial biological entities. The subject was so sensitive, he told me, because the United States government was scared that if the public knew something from outer space was able to pick up heavy animals in beams of light, remove tissue and liquids with advanced instruments, and then return the animals dead and mutilated to pastures, that Americans and the world would panic. Also, the advanced technologies needed to be kept out of the hands of our human enemies and developed and patented by American companies. That, he said, was of the highest priority. Going back to the Corona rancher telling me there was a horrible secret at the Corona, New Mexico UFO crash, I think that the horrible secret was animal parts found inside one crash disk and dissected bodies found outside another crash disk. One of the many important documents gathered by Bob and Ryan Wood and displayed for study at their website, majesticdocuments.com. If anybody in here doesn't go to www.majesticdocuments.com, I urge you to do this. So the documents that I'm going to excerpt tonight and so many more are at this important website for the public to see what are allegedly real government documents about this incredibly complex phenomena. And so few people seem to realize that. So I urge you all, go to majesticdocuments.com. This one is entitled Top Secret Ultra Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit Summary Intelligence Assessment, and this IPU document begins, quote, "The extraordinary recovery of fallen airborne objects in the state of New Mexico between 4 July to 6 July 1947. This, by the way, is a leaked document that, as far as the Woods and others investigating inks, type styles, is as far, and Dr. Wood would say this is an authentic document. This summary was prepared by Headquarters Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, Scientific and Technical Branch, Counterintelligence Directorate, as requested by A period, C period of S period G2 at the expressed order of Chief of Staff," unquote. The IPU intelligence assessment was reclassified on September 4th, 1960, as, quote, "affecting the national security," and has been upgraded as above top secret with a need-to-know basis. Only those authorized persons with magic access may have access. Upgrading scheduled to commence only with an approved presidential executive order with approval of U.S. majestic intelligence and security, unquote. This reclassification was done by the authority of Lieutenant General John Samford, Director of the National Security Agency, and approved by Alan Dulles, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and stamped Top Secret Ultra. On page 6 of the IPU document, 5 alien bodies are described as they were found with a crashed aerial vehicle at a site on the northern end of White Sands Missile Range in July 1947. That was identified as Landing Zone 2. Here's Corona, Landing Zone 1, the Mac Brazel Ranch. Landing Zone 2 near the Trinity site where we dropped the atomic bomb first test in 1945. And Landing Zone 3 east of Alamogordo, near the Mescalero Apache Indian Reservation. First, on page 2, paragraph 4, the IPU intelligence assessment states, quote, "On arrival at LZ2, personnel assessed the finds as not belonging to any aircraft, rocket, weapons, or balloon tests that are normally conducted from surrounding bases. First reports indicated that the first crash investigators from Roswell Army Air Force found that at LZ1 was the remains of an Army Air Force top secret mogul balloon project." And this is where the collision of a balloon and an object seems to be emerging, just like in that FBI, the telegram at the beginning of the presentation. They did find the remains of a Project Mogul balloon, but that's not all that they found there, as is going to become evident here. When scientists from the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory arrived to inspect Landing Zone 2, that's the Trinity site at White Sands, it became apparent to all concerned that what had crashed in the desert was something out of this world. Also, the IPU intelligence assessment paragraph 11 states, quote, "As to the bodies recovered at Landing Zone 2, it appeared that none of the 5 crew members survived entry into our atmosphere due to unknown causes. Dr. Detlef Bronk, he's also on the Truman Majestic 12 list, has been asked to assist in the autopsy of one well-preserved cadaver to be done by Major Charles Ray. From what descriptions the team was able to learn and from photographs taken by intelligence photographers, the occupants appear in most respects human, with some anatomical differences in the head, eyes, hands, and feet. They have a slight build, about 5 feet tall, with grayish pink skin color. They have no hair on their bodies and are clothed with a tight-fitting flight suit that appears to be fireproof. Some of the bodies looked as if they had been burned on head and hands. Their overall stature reminds one of young children. It is believed that there were male and female genders present, but it was hard to distinguish. The most disturbing aspect of this investigation was there were other bodies found not far from Landing Zone 1 at the Mac Brazel site between Corona and Roswell that looked as if they had been dissected, and it's misspelled in this report, had been dissected as you would a frog. It is not known if Army field surgeons had performed exploratory surgery on these bodies. That qualifier indicated to some of us, even though it's not specified, that the bodies might be humanoid rather than animal. Animal parts were reportedly discovered inside the craft at Landing Zone 2, which was at the White Sands Missile Range site. But this cannot be confirmed. The team has reserved judgment on this issue. I also was told in the 1980s that one of the reasons that the Aztec crash was put under such a firm lock and key by the United States government is that when they got inside of that disk, the 99-foot diameter one, they found that the entire perimeter was all molded, that it was as if if we were capable of doing something 99 feet and making it all molded on the inside, and yet the mold had moving parts like drawers. And all of the drawers were supposed to be of different sizes, as if the whole thing had been calculated for very specific, containing of very specific sized objects. And when they opened up those containers, I was told they found a lot of animal parts inside of the Aztec craft. Dissected human bodies and animal parts inside of one of the craft must have scared President Truman and his colleagues so badly that they all agreed that a tight lid had to be placed on the UFO phenomenon, a policy of complete denial in the interest of national security while they tried to learn more and figure out what they were up against. Thus, the reason for the National Security Act of 1947 that created the Central Intelligence Agency, the Majestic 12 Special Studies Group, and presidential executive orders that required everyone associated with the extraterrestrial investigations to lie and misinform the press and the public in order to prevent panic and to maintain national security. And I have been told by more than one person, we must lie even before a congressional investigation. In addition to the dissected humanoids and animal parts, there was another disturbing event that would also have provoked the Truman administration's decision to keep all the real facts about UFOs and what was in them from the press and the public. In the year 1952, Truman's Majestic 12 Special Studies Group issued its first annual report as, quote, a review of the President's special panel to investigate the capture of unidentified plan-form space vehicles by U.S. armed forces and agencies, unquote. And back in the 40s, plan-form was a common word used then to describe anything that had sort of flat, curvy surfaces. On page 5 of the top secret MJ-12 report is paragraph F, biological warfare programs, which states, quote, biological warfare programs in US and UK are in field test stages. Discovery of new virus and bacteria agents so lethal that serums derived by genetic research can launch medical science into unheard fields of biology. The samples extracted from bodies found in New Mexico have yielded new strains of a retrovirus not totally understood, but give promise of the ultimate biological warfare weapon. The danger lies in the spread of airborne and blood-borne outbreaks of diseases in large populations with no medical cures available, unquote. Now, retrovirus was not a common medical concept in 1947. We've tried very hard to find if Detlef Bronk used the term retrovirus in any of his medical writings. Examples of retroviruses today are HIV, leukemia, and the deadly Ebola virus that causes its victims to hemorrhage blood from every orifice, including the eyes. Retroviruses are composed only of RNA, which ends up getting healthy DNA in the host to incorporate the insidious RNA instructions into the genome of the cells, which then destroy. On page 9 of the top secret MJ-12 report, it states, quote, "The panel was concerned over the contamination of several special engineering detachment personnel upon coming in contact with debris near the power plant of the craft, and that SED security detachment was from the 509th Composite Group based at Los Alamos with the Manhattan Project. One SED technician was overcome and collapsed when he attempted the removal of a body. Another medical technician went into a coma only 4 hours after placing a body in a rubber body bag. All 4 were rushed to Los Alamos for observation. All 4 later died of seizures and profuse bleeding. All 4 were wearing protective suits when they came in contact with body fluids from the occupants, raising the question, how was the contamination accomplished if they were in fact in protective suits? Autopsies on the 4 dead SED technicians are not conclusive. It is believed that the 4 may have suffered from some form of toxin or a highly contagious disease. Tissue samples are currently being kept at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and I would wager they are still there today. In the opinion of the Senior Atomic Energy Commission medical officer, current medical equipment and supplies are wholly inadequate in dealing with a large-scale outbreak of the alien virus, unquote. In summary, it would seem that compartmentalized insiders of the U.S. government have been running scared since at least 1947 and trying to keep any signs of their fear and lack of control from the press and the public. The peculiar phenomena that Colonel Turner mentioned in 1947 at White Sands that could simply appear in flight alongside top-secret V-2 launch rockets and apparently cause the V-2 rockets to change course and crash. And then when the government allegedly used weapons to forcefully bring some of the peculiar phenomena down to Earth, human airplanes seemed to crash at an alarming rate between early May and the end of July 1947, provoking President Truman to call for a special investigation of the aviation crisis. Former New Mexico State Representative Andy Kistner said that he thinks many of those airplane crashes were retaliation for U.S. aggression against the foreign discs. Perhaps the peculiar phenomena was here or still is here, only to monitor Earth for whatever incomprehensible reason, and has never intended harm until threatened by human military aggression. But then, there were the bodies dissected as one would a frog, including animal parts referenced in the government's own highly classified interplanetary unit and Majestic 12 reports, plus the hemorrhaging deaths of security men who handled the crash site humanoids. The animal mutilations are famous for being bloodless, without tracks associated with mysterious lights and beams, and they continue worldwide to date. And what about all of those human abduction complaints since the 1960s, also associated with mysterious lights and beams? Colonel Turner's peculiar phenomena have continued into the 21st century, but someone seems to have stopped disks crashing. Did the peculiar phenomena change, or did our military strategy? Because payback was too painful then, as it is now.